Spotify wraps up some stats, the latest from our daily newsletter at podnews.net. Spotify has launched 2022 Podcaster Wrapped, a treasure trove of growth, insights and data, they say, about your podcast. We learned that the Podcast Daily is 7 people's most listened to podcast on the platform, apparently. Thank you if that's you. Buzzsprout has published its network statistics for November, the only regularly released IAB-compliant numbers. They show a slight drop for Apple Podcasts and a smaller rise for Spotify. Google Podcasts is the 3rd largest podcast app. Now, Buzzsprout don't give any Apple core media traffic to Apple Podcasts, but there again, Apple has automated downloads, which Spotify and Google don't normally. But even after revising those numbers, Apple's still number 1, we think. Magellan AI is announcing a new collaboration with Experian. The Experian Identity Graph will power attribution by Magellan AI, the company's new attribution platform. In Germany, a podcast analytics startup, Voxelize, has raised a pre-seed round of €1.2 million. That's $1.3 million. Air Media is to make a show about conman David Bloom, which will be narrated by model and TV star Caroline D'Amore, who's one of Bloom's victims. Guide an augmented audio experience, like a podcast, working tour and workshop, all rolled into one, they say, has been highlighted as one of Fast Company's next big things in tech for 2022. Audio Labs has just launched. It's a service that lets podcasters make videos from audio-only podcasts to help promote their shows on YouTube Shorts, TikTok or Reels. We link to an example featuring sharks and pigs. It's pretty good. The tool uses generative AI. The new issue of Pod Bible magazine is out now for you to read, featuring interviews with cover star Mark Maron from WTF. Paul Condo's Podcast Gumbo newsletter is on hiatus until perhaps April 2023, Paul writes. And 2 new apps for you. Castle is a podcast app that transcribes every podcast it plays and lets you search the transcriptions. Meanwhile, Shake is a short-form audio social media platform, currently invite-only for iOS, sharing audio snacks and promoting itself as not another podcast app. Last thing we want. And thank you to remote audio company CleanFeed, who have updated their support. When the Emmy award-winning company originally supported us, Patreon only did US dollars, but CleanFeed just switched to their preferred currency of UK pounds instead. And you can do that too at podnews.net/support. In People News, Chris Bourne was made head of Spotify Studios UK and Ireland a few weeks ago. He'd worked at Global for 8 years, most recently as head of podcast production, and also worked for Deezer. And some sad news, podcast sound designer Brian Vasquez is seriously ill in hospital. An independent sound designer has worked with many people and has no medical insurance. There's a GoFundMe page which has been set up for his family if you'd like to help. You'll want to go to helpbrian.net. That's helpbrian.net, and Brian is spelt with an I. It's a Monday, so time for some tech stuff. If you're using the Podping Watcher, make sure you're running the latest version due to a new JSON schema. RSS Blue has launched an RSS feed validator, which supports many Podcasting 2.0 features. And like buses, 2 podcast validators come along at once. The Livewire podcast validator shows cross-app comments too. And speaking of cross-app comments, Podnews now natively supports cross-app comments for this podcast using ActivityPub. You'll find the socialInteract tag in our RSS feed, and we would love to know if your app surfaces them, or even better, allows people to leave comments. John Spurlock is showing and graphing podcast index statistics, and we are also taking some data from those statistics in our newsletter. If you'd like to pull OP3 redirect logs for a specific day via PHP, then we've linked to a gist to do that. Don't laugh at my poor PHP code, because it's mine. And Pocket Casts has released version 7.27 last week, which appears to contain a user agent fix so that it no longer calls itself Apple Core Media. And we've confirmed by listening to an episode of Podclock that it now correctly calls itself Pocket Casts when playing on-demand shows. And where Pocket Cast leads, Apple Podcasts itself may follow, but not yet, because iOS 16.2 Beta 4 was released on Friday, and Apple Podcasts still doesn't use the correct key to set the app's user agent correctly when playing on-demand audio, so it hides behind the generic Apple Core Media user agent. And in podcast news, People Spooning has just featured a week of actors from Stranger Things. The podcast is hosted by Tristan Spoon, who played 2 in the show, so perhaps that's why he was able to book a couple of others. The show focuses on the tipping points in their acting careers that led to booking professional work. Cookery by the Book is to end. After 7 years, the show achieved more than 2.5 million downloads. Host Susie Chase will work on sister podcast Decorating by the Book and is collaborating with Vizzy to release enhanced episodes on popular podcast apps. By 2050, 2/3 of the world's population will live in cities. And how to really run a city is new from the Philadelphia Citizen, telling us how mayors and their teams should be innovating. It's hosted by Atlanta's former mayor and Philadelphia's former mayor, and fittingly for a podcast from Philadelphia, it's hosted by Libsyn, who are based there. 4 days work for 5 days pay might sound too good to be true, but that's what's being offered to 3,500 employees in the UK right now. Working It, the Financial Times' premier workplace trends podcast, is following 4 companies in that radical experiment. Is it possible to have 100% productivity for 80% of the time and 100% of the pay? The miniseries starts today. Naturally, it lasts for just 4 days, and it's produced by Novel. And the British tradition of a pantomime is a bit difficult to explain to somebody who has no idea what one is. So in the latest episode of the Podcast for Kids Armchair Adventures, Connie and a bunch of school kids will tell you all about it with a sing and dance along of the top 10 panto ingredients, top of the panto bits. It's full of bad jokes, celebrity guests and happy endings. Oh, no, it isn't. Oh, yes, it is. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.